My in-laws spent 9 years trying to destroy my marriage. My husband took their side every single time. When I finally left, he told everyone I abandoned him for no reason. 9 years of his family working to end us. 9 years of him choosing them over and over. When I finally walked away, I became the villain in his story. My name is Claire Sutton. I am 38 years old. And 14 months ago, I ended my 9-year marriage. My husband has told most of the people we know that he never saw it coming. That I ended things suddenly, without warning, for reasons he still does not fully understand. He has said he tried everything he could. He has described the separation as something that happened to him. He has not mentioned his mother's comment to our children, which was the last thing and not the only thing. He has not mentioned the 9 years. I am going to tell you about the 9 years. I met Daniel when I was 27. He was 30, established in his work as an architect, comfortable in the specific way of men who have always moved through the world with reasonable ease, and who have not yet encountered a challenge they could not navigate by being charming and capable and well-liked. He was genuinely funny. He remembered things. He would mention something I had said weeks earlier in a context that showed he had actually been listening, which is not as common as it should be. He was affectionate in a way that was natural rather than performed, the kind of man who reaches for your hand in a movie theater without thinking about it, who texts you a specific thing he saw that reminded him of you. He was, in the years before we married, one of the most considerate people I had been in a relationship with. I want to describe him accurately because what I am going to say about the marriage could suggest a man who was unkind or indifferent or deliberately harmful, and that is not who Daniel is. He is someone who loved me and who, when confronted with a conflict between that love and the peace of his relationship with his family of origin, consistently chose his family's peace, not because he did not value me but because the emotional architecture of his childhood made it impossible for him to hold both things at once. He had been shaped, in ways he never examined and that I eventually stopped trying to help him examine, to prioritize his mother's comfort above all other things. That is not cruelty. It is a kind of damage. Cost me 9 years. I do not think it is simple. We were together for 2 years before we married. Those 2 years were good in the ways that the beginning of a relationship you want is good. You are building something and the building is exciting, and the person you are building with is someone you have chosen deliberately and with your whole attention. I was happy. I want that to be in this story because it was real. In those 2 years I met his family. His father Robert was easy, a relaxed, affable man who treated me warmly from the first meeting, and who has continued to treat me warmly throughout and after the marriage. He is not the kind of man who sets the social temperature of the family. That is not his role. Patricia sets the social temperature. She is 64, a retired administrator, a woman of definite preferences and the confidence to enforce them. She was formal with me from the first meeting. Not rude, she was careful in those early months to not be rude in any way that could be named or raised, but formal in the specific way of women who are assessing rather than welcoming, whose questions, though politely phrased, are designed to determine where you fall on a private scale of adequacy. She asked about my family, my education, my work, my plans, in a way that felt like a file being opened rather than a conversation being started. I understood, on some level I could not quite articulate at the time, that I was being evaluated and that the evaluation was not going especially well. I came from a different kind of family than Daniel. My parents both worked, our house was loud and informal, we were affectionate with each other in visible and unself-conscious ways. We did not particularly manage how we appeared to the outside world because we did not think about it. Patricia's world was different. She valued the careful management of presentation, the right attire for occasions, the correct hospitality for guests, the specific grammar of middle-class propriety that tells people in her social register that a household is being run correctly. I was not instinctively fluent in this grammar. I learned significant portions of it over 9 years of marriage because the marriage required it, but the learning was always visible as learning, and Patricia saw every place where it was still in progress. Amber was closer in age to me than to her mother, and her method was different, less formal, more immediate, but the effect was similar. She and Daniel had a particular closeness, the closeness of siblings who have been each other's primary confidant for extended periods, who communicate in a register that assumes constant access. She texted him continuously. She called him daily. She expected him to answer, and he always answered because answering Amber was not a decision Daniel made each time. It was a reflex, a habit of years, something he did the way he breathed without consciously choosing it. She was not hostile to me in the early years. She was simply present in Daniel's life in a quantity and quality that did not naturally adjust to accommodate the fact that he had taken on a primary relationship with someone else. His time and attention had a prior claim, and the claim was hers, and she did not see any reason why his marriage should alter that significantly. This is, I have come to understand, a position that is genuinely held rather than cynically maintained. She was not trying to undermine me. She was simply not making the adjustment that his marriage required, and Daniel was not asking her to. When I married Daniel, I knew these conditions existed. I did not fully understand how permanent they would be, or how completely they would resist the ordinary pressures that family relationships usually respond to over time. I believe that as Daniel and I built our life together, and as Patricia and Amber came to know me as a daughter-in-law and sister-in-law over years of shared experience, the relationships would find their natural shape and the friction would diminish. I was not naive. I was optimistic. Those are different errors. Naive means you do not see the problem. Optimistic means you see it and believe that time and effort will resolve it. I saw the problem and I believed in my own ability to address it. I was wrong about that second part. The first year was manageable, in the way that a first year of marriage is often manageable even when the underlying conditions are difficult. Everything is still new enough that you have the energy to absorb difficulty, and the hope that the newness will resolve into something easier. Patricia's criticisms were gentle in that first year, delivered in the mode of guidance rather than judgment. The spice cabinet reorganization was the first thing I could not quite tell myself was well-intentioned. She had come for a visit, spent an afternoon in our home while Daniel was at work, and reorganized my kitchen cabinet, the spices and the dry goods, into her preferred system, which she explained to me when I came home as though she had done me a favor. It was in her kitchen, she said, that she had developed the system over years and it really did work much better, and she had noticed that my way was a little haphazard. I thanked her. I went to the bedroom and I sat on the bed for a few minutes and then I called my mother. When I raised it with Daniel that evening, he said she was just trying to help and that I should take it in the spirit it was intended. I tried. I tried to take every iteration of Patricia's attention in the spirit it was intended for 7 more years after that. The incidents that followed were individually minor and collectively significant in the way of water on stone. The accumulation is what matters, not any single drop. She arrived at our house without calling ahead 3 times in the second year and twice in the third. She commented on our children's clothing when they arrived for visits, a gentle observation that the older one's shoes seemed a little worn, a question about whether the younger one's coat was warm enough for the weather. She told Daniel, on an occasion I discovered only when he mentioned it months later, that she worried I was not managing the household correctly, and that perhaps it was worth having a conversation. She organized a family dinner on a date that conflicted with plans Daniel and I had made and expected us to change our plans, and Daniel changed our plans without discussing it with me first. She sent Daniel articles about parenting, specifically about what she called the right approach to various things, that were implicitly criticisms of choices I had made and that Daniel forwarded to me with a note that said his mother thought these were interesting. The Amber dynamic was its own separate layer. I want to be specific about what the daily calls meant to our marriage over 9 years because I think it is the kind of thing that is easy to minimize if you have not experienced it. A daily call from a sibling is not, on its own, a problem. But a daily call that is answered regardless of context, at dinner, in the middle of a conversation, on the first vacation Daniel and I took after our first child was born, on Christmas morning when we were opening presents with our children, becomes something. It becomes the ongoing presence of a third party in the marriage, a presence that signals to everyone in the household, including the children eventually, that Amber's claim on Daniel's time takes precedence over whatever is happening in the present moment. I asked Daniel at various points across the 9 years to let Amber's calls go to voicemail during meals. He agreed twice. He did not maintain it either time. He agreed once to have a conversation with Amber about adjusting the frequency of contact when something was not urgent. He had the conversation or said he did, and for 2 weeks Amber called every other day, and then it returned to daily. I asked him in the 6th year whether he was willing to establish any limit at all on the times and circumstances in which Amber had access to him. He said Amber was his sister and that was how they were and that I needed to accept it. Across 9 years I raised the issue of his family's impact on our marriage in the specific, concrete, constructive way I had learned from 3 attempts at couples therapy, framing it around the impact on me rather than the character of his family, focusing on behaviors rather than motivations, asking for specific adjustments rather than a general change of orientation. I had read enough about this particular kind of family dynamic to know the right approach. I used the right approach. It did not produce different results because Daniel's response to the right approach, consistently applied across 9 years, was to agree in the moment and not change anything afterward, or to minimize what I had described, or to tell me I was being too sensitive. The phrase too sensitive is one I need to examine directly, because it was the primary tool used against my perceptions across 9 years. When I said Patricia's comment about my household management made me feel undermined, I was told I was too sensitive. When I said Amber's call during our anniversary dinner was hurtful, I was too sensitive. When I raised the children's clothing comments as a pattern, I was too sensitive. The word was used consistently enough and across enough incidents that it eventually began to do its intended work, which was to shift the location of the problem from his family's behavior to my response to it. If the problem was that I was too sensitive, then nothing his family did needed to change. I simply needed to develop a thicker skin. That is a very convenient location for the problem. It requires him to do nothing. I want to say plainly, I am not too sensitive. I am a woman who pays attention. What I noticed across 9 years was real. What I described was accurately described. What I asked for was reasonable. The problem was never my sensitivity. The problem was that the behavior I was describing was real, and that addressing it would have required Daniel to have a different kind of relationship with his family than the kind he was willing to have, and he was not willing to do that. I spent years wondering whether there was something I was missing, whether there was a way of understanding the family dynamics that would make them make more sense, whether I was imposing my own family's template on a family that operated differently. I gave this a great deal of thought. I gave it probably more thought than was warranted because the alternative explanation was that what was happening was what it looked like, and I did not want to accept that for a long time. What it looked like was this. His mother believed she retained significant standing in Daniel's life and household after his marriage, that this standing gave her the right to evaluate and comment on the management of that household, and that Daniel's primary obligation was to her comfort rather than to mine. His sister believed his marriage should not significantly alter his availability to her. And Daniel, who loved me genuinely, I am not revising that, Daniel had been formed in this family in ways that made their expectations feel like the natural order of things and my objections feel like a request to be treated specially, rather than a request to be treated as his primary person. I tried to be his primary person for 9 years. He kept showing me that I was not. And in those 9 years I paid the cost of the situation fully, in the specific ways that fell to me. I want to say what that looked like because it deserves to be said, and it will not appear in the version of events Daniel is telling. I hosted his family for every major holiday of our 9-year marriage. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, at our house with food I planned and bought and cooked over 2 or 3 days, because Patricia's expectations for a proper holiday table were specific and I had learned over years exactly what they were. I organized the children's birthday parties in ways that incorporated her preferences about venue and what was appropriate, because when I did not, Daniel received phone calls in the week after that required managing, and that produced the specific kind of household tension I had spent years learning to prevent. I drove our children to Patricia's house on the regular Thursday visits even in the years when arriving at that house cost me something, because our children deserved their grandmother, and that was separate from what I felt about the woman. I wrote birthday cards and Christmas cards and Mother's Day cards for Patricia, and for Amber for 9 consecutive years. I thought about them and wrote them carefully, in the mode of a person who understands that the relationship matters to her husband and is trying to honor it. I bought gifts for Patricia that reflected her tastes, which I had spent years learning, and delivered them, and received the specific thanks of a woman who is mildly surprised to find something adequate. I attended Amber's events, her baby shower, her children's birthday parties, a wedding anniversary celebration she organized in the 7th year, and I was warm and present and behaved like a sister-in-law who was glad to be there, because not attending would have required explaining and the explanation would have been a conversation with Daniel that produced nothing. I tried to repair the relationship with Patricia directly twice. In the 3rd year I suggested that we have lunch alone, the 2 of us without Daniel or the children, so that we could build something in a context that was not already socially managed. She agreed. We had a pleasant lunch that led nowhere. In the 6th year, after a particularly difficult period, I asked her directly if there was something I could do differently that would help us get along better. She said everything was fine, and the tone of it closed the conversation rather than opening it. None of this is in the story Daniel has told about the end of our marriage. The 9 years of trying, the holidays and the cards and the Thursday drives and the lunches that went nowhere and the gifts and the birthday parties and the continuous expenditure of energy that goes into maintaining a relationship with someone who has decided you are insufficient, is not present in his account. His account contains a happy marriage and then, without warning or cause, no marriage. My account contains 9 years of cause and the patience of a woman who kept trying past the point where the trying was reasonable, until an October afternoon when she stood in a doorway and heard a grandmother tell her grandchildren that mommy was the problem, and something in her finally and completely stopped. The incident with our children happened on a Thursday afternoon in October, 14 months ago. It was a regular visit. Patricia came to our house most Thursday afternoons when the children were home from school, a standing arrangement Daniel had established in the 3rd year of their lives, and that I had accepted because I understood it mattered to him that his children know their grandmother. I want to be precise about this. I had accepted her regular presence in our home and in our children's lives even during the years when my relationship with her was most strained, because I believed that the children's relationship with their grandmother was separate from my feelings about my mother-in-law, and that separating those things was the right thing to do. On that Thursday, I was in the kitchen. The children were in the living room with Patricia. I could hear the television and the specific murmur of an adult talking to children. I was not paying particular attention to the content of it until I heard my name, and then I stopped and I listened. Patricia was telling them, in the gentle and slightly theatrical tone she uses with children under 10, that sometimes mommies and daddies get stressed, and that when mommies got stressed they were not always as nice as they could be, and that this sometimes made daddies sad, and that it was nobody's fault when mommies got stressed, and that if they ever felt worried about things in the house they could always come and talk to Grandma Patricia because Grandma Patricia was always there for them, and always would be. I stood in the doorway to the living room. She had not heard me come from the kitchen. Our older child was listening with the particular attention children give to adults who are telling them something that feels significant. Our younger one was looking at the television. Patricia looked up and we looked at each other. There was a second of stillness and then she smiled and said something to the children about whether anyone wanted juice, and the moment passed and I went back to the kitchen. I got through the rest of the visit. This required effort I will not minimize. I offered juice. I asked after Patricia's health. I contributed appropriately to the conversation. I functioned as a competent adult in my own kitchen while my children were in the next room, and my mother-in-law finished her visit and said her goodbyes and left. After the children were in bed, I told Daniel what I had heard. I was careful. I had learned over 9 years that the mode of my delivery significantly affected whether Daniel could hear the content of what I was saying, and I was careful about the mode. I told him word for word what Patricia had said. I told him I had heard it directly from the doorway, and that there was no ambiguity in the language or its meaning. I told him I needed him to understand what this meant to me. He said his mother probably had not meant it the way it sounded. I have thought about that sentence many times in the 14 months since. It is, in some ways, the perfect encapsulation of 9 years of the same response in miniature. Not, "That sounds genuinely wrong, let me think about what to do." Not, "I hear you, this is a problem." His mother probably had not meant it the way it sounded. The word probably applied to a sentence that had a clear and unambiguous meaning. The invitation to me, as in all the previous years, to search for a more charitable interpretation and absorb the damage in the spirit it was probably intended. I said, "She told our children that I make you unhappy and that things would be better if I were nicer. That is what the words mean. There is no other version of that sentence." He said she was probably trying to reassure the children if they had sensed tension. I said, "She does not get to reassure our children about our marriage. That is not her role." And what she said was not reassurance, it was a characterization of me as the problem, delivered to children who are 7 and 5 years old, in a context where they will absorb it as fact. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would talk to her. I said that for 9 years talking to her had not produced any change, and that I needed something different this time. I told him I needed him to tell Patricia directly and clearly that speaking to our children about our marriage was not something she was allowed to do. I told him I needed him to tell her that if she did it again there would be a consequence, that her visits would be supervised or less frequent or structured differently, something that made clear the limit was real and not performative. I told him I needed to see that he was willing to act as my partner in this rather than as the person who mediated between me and his mother. He said he needed time to think about how to approach it. I said, "You have 2 weeks. In 2 weeks I need to see that you have had a real conversation with her. Not a gentle suggestion, not a request to be more careful, but a clear and direct statement that this cannot continue. And I need you to tell me what you said." In those 2 weeks he called Patricia twice. I know this because we were still living in the same house and he made both calls in the evenings in his study, and I heard enough to know who he was talking to. I do not know what was said. He called Amber 3 times. I know this because his phone was on the kitchen table once when Amber's name appeared on the screen and I saw the call log when I glanced at it inadvertently. He did not call a therapist, couples or otherwise. He did not ask me how I was doing. He did not volunteer any information about what he was doing or how the conversations were going. In 2 weeks of living in the same house, he did not once say to me, "Here is what I am doing to address this." At the end of 2 weeks I asked him what had happened. He said he had spoken to his mother, and that she understood and that it would not happen again. I asked what he had said. He said he had told her she needed to be more careful about what she said around the children. I sat with those words. He had told her to be more careful. Not what you did was wrong. Not, this is a pattern that has to stop. Not, If this happens again, there will be a consequence. Be more careful. Which, as Patricia would have heard it, meant, do this where Claire cannot hear. I told him I was filing for a separation. The shock on his face was real. I want to acknowledge that because it was real and because it tells something important about the gap between what he had understood to be happening and what was actually happening. He had heard me, over 9 years, raise the same concerns in different registers and with varying degrees of urgency, and each time he had managed it sufficiently to return to equilibrium, and the equilibrium had always held. He did not understand that the equilibrium was being maintained by my continued effort to absorb and accommodate and try again, and that when I stopped making that effort, there was no equilibrium to return to. He said he had done what I asked. I said, you did the minimum possible version of what I asked in a way that does not change anything, and I have been telling you for 9 years that this is a problem, and you have addressed it with a minimum possible version of action every time, and I do not have any more of this left in me. He said he did not understand why this was different from any other time I had been upset. I said, because of our children, because she crossed into them, because I have protected them from this for 9 years and I can no longer protect them from it if you will not help me, and you have demonstrated in 2 weeks that you will not help me. That was the conversation. We had others in the days and weeks that followed, difficult, painful conversations that covered the ground of 9 years in fragments, in the exhausting way of a marriage coming apart. But that conversation was the end. The separation process was what separations are. There were lawyers and a mediator and the practical work of untangling a 9-year household and establishing a custody arrangement for 2 children who deserved to be well managed through something that was hard for everyone. Daniel and I did this decently, because whatever else was true about our marriage, we had always agreed that our children came first, and we managed the separation in the light of that agreement. What Daniel did alongside the practical process of separation was tell a story. He told Patricia, Amber, his friends, and our mutual acquaintances that the separation had come without warning, that he had done everything he could, that he did not understand why this was happening, that he was devastated and bewildered by Claire's decision. He told this story consistently and it spread as stories spread through the social network we had shared for 9 years, and it became the version of events that most people who knew us had. Patricia expressed publicly, through mutual acquaintances who related to me, her sympathy for Daniel and her sadness about the whole situation. Amber told a friend we had in common that I had always had difficulty being part of a close family, and that it was a shame. The narrative that formed around me in the social world I had inhabited for 9 years was the narrative of a woman who had inexplicably ended a marriage, leaving a man who had loved her and tried everything. It was a clean story. It had the specific appeal of simple narratives. There was a victim and there was an agent of damage and the lines were clear. I was not in the story he told. Not as a person who had been paying attention to something real for 9 years and who had finally run out of patience for being told she was imagining it. Not as a woman who had bitten her tongue at 1,000 comments and written 1,000 birthday cards and driven her children to a grandmother's house even in the years when that grandmother was speaking poorly of her to her husband. That version of me was not in the story Daniel told. Only the woman who had ended the marriage and left him bewildered. He chose that story because the alternative requires him to examine something about himself, his relationship with his family and what it cost me and what he chose when he was forced to choose, that he is not yet capable of examining. I say not yet because I do not know what he will or will not eventually understand. What I know is what he has been willing to examine so far, which is as little as possible, and that the story he has told about our marriage reflects that willingness. I understand why he told it that way. Understanding it does not mean I accept it. He told it that way because the accurate version requires him to examine something about himself that he has never been willing to examine, the part where he had a choice for 9 years about whether to stand with his wife or stand with his family, and he consistently chose his family, and that choosing had a cost and the cost was his marriage. That is the true and accurate version of what happened. It requires him to be the person who made decisions that contributed to the end of something he loved. He is not able to be that person yet. Perhaps he will be eventually. But the story he is telling in the meantime is not the truth. I am 38 years old. I share custody of 2 children and I am 14 months into building a life that is entirely mine in a way that my life has not been mine since I was 27. I want to say something about what that feels like because I think the experience of a woman who has just ended a 9-year marriage is often imagined as primarily grief and loss, and grief and loss are real parts of it, but they are not the whole of it. There is also something that I can only describe as the feeling of a room when a persistent noise you have stopped consciously noticing finally stops. A quality of quiet that you did not know was missing until it arrived. The specific relief of a person who has been managing a sustained difficulty for so long that the management became invisible, and who discovers in its absence how much energy the management was consuming. I am not saying the separation was easy or right without cost. I am saying that the costs it has produced, while real, are not greater than the costs the marriage was producing by the end, and that has surprised me in the way that honest self-assessment sometimes does. My children are adjusting. Children are not well served by the adults around them pretending that hard things are not hard, but they are served by adults who handle hard things with consistency, and without requiring the children to manage the adults' feelings. Daniel and I have both tried to do that. On the measure of not burdening the children with the specifics of what happened between us, we have both behaved well, and I am genuinely grateful for that, because it would have been easier in some moments not to. My therapist said something several months ago that I have thought about consistently since. She said that the goal of the work we were doing was not to arrive at a place where the 9 years had not happened, but to arrive at a place where I could carry them without being organized by them. That is a useful distinction. The 9 years happened. They shaped me. They cost me things. I cannot undo them, and I am not trying to. What I am trying to do is stop letting them determine what I believe about myself. Stop letting the accumulated weight of being told I was too sensitive become the primary lens through which I understand my own perceptions and responses. That work is not finished. It is going better than I expected. I notice now, with some regularity, that I am trusting my own read on a situation without first asking whether I am being too sensitive, and that noticing feels like progress. Small progress repeated is still progress. I told this story because it needed to be told somewhere true, not in the social world where Daniel's version has circulated. Here, where what I say is what I mean and where the 9 years are in it, and where the woman who kept trying for too long for a reason she believed in gets to say what she tried and why she stopped and where she is now. The practical shape of my life now is this. I have an apartment in Portland that I moved into 8 months ago, after a period of staying with my sister while the logistics of the separation resolved. It is a good apartment, more mine in the specific way of spaces that are chosen and arranged entirely by one person, than any room I occupied in our shared house ever quite was. The children are with me on alternating weeks and with Daniel on alternating weeks, and the arrangement works as well as these arrangements can work when the people involved are committed to making them work for the children's sake, which we are. Daniel and I communicate by text about the children, logistics, schedules, school things, medical appointments. We are civil. We have been civil consistently and without effort, which is one of the things I find myself grateful for in the ordinary daily way of gratitude that is not dramatic but that is real. We do not discuss the marriage. We do not discuss his family. We manage the present and we do not relitigate the past, and this is the correct approach and I endorse it fully. What I am working through, separately, privately, in conversations with a therapist I began seeing 6 months ago, is the specific damage that 9 years of being told you are too sensitive does to a person's relationship with her own perceptions. I want to talk about this because I think it is the part of this kind of experience that is least discussed and most important. The obvious harm of what happened is the marriage ending, the family structure changing, the disruption to the children and to both of our lives. That harm is real and I have felt it fully and I am not minimizing it. But the subtler harm, the one I am still excavating, is what happens to your ability to trust yourself when someone you love tells you, repeatedly across 9 years, that what you are perceiving is not accurate. Gaslighting is a word that is used so frequently now that it risks losing its precision. I want to be precise. Daniel did not, I believe, deliberately set out to make me doubt my perceptions. He was not conducting a campaign to destabilize my sense of reality. He was, more simply and in some ways more harmlessly and in some ways more damagingly, unable to see what I was describing, and because he could not see it, he told me it was not there. Over and over. With consistency and with the specific authority of a person who is your primary relationship, and whose opinion of your perceptions you have agreed to weight heavily. The effect over 9 years was real regardless of his intention. I became someone who second-guessed herself. I became someone who, when I noticed something that bothered me, immediately examined whether the noticing was justified or whether I was being too sensitive. I spent enormous energy across 9 years, adjudicating between my own experience and the version of my experience that Daniel offered. That is exhausting. It is also distorting. A person who is constantly asking whether what she is perceiving is real rather than simply acting on what she perceives becomes, over time, less capable of acting on her own behalf. She waits. She checks. She gives the benefit of the doubt one more time. She tries to see it from another perspective. She tries harder. I was in therapy for 6 months before my therapist named this dynamic and I could hear the name without recoiling from it. I recoiled initially because accepting the name meant accepting a certain picture of my marriage that felt too bleak, too clear, too much at odds with the genuine love that was also in it. It took several more months to understand that both things were true, that Daniel loved me, and that his inability to hear what I was telling him about his family's impact on our marriage had the specific effect of eroding my ability to trust my own account of my experience. Both things were true. Neither canceled the other. And both things are part of why the marriage ended. I am a more intact person now than I was 14 months ago, which is something I did not expect to be able to say this quickly. The expectation I had of myself was that the separation would be primarily difficult and that reconstruction would be slow, and that I would be managing grief for longer than I wanted to be managing it. Instead, what I found in the months after leaving was something closer to relief. The relief of a person who has been managing a sustained difficulty and who has put it down. The relief of a person who is no longer being told that what she is perceiving is not real. The relief of living in a house where, when I notice something, I am the person who decides whether it matters. I do not know what Daniel's understanding of what happened will become over time. I do not know whether he will, eventually, examine what he chose for 9 years and understand what that choosing cost his marriage and cost me. I hope he does, not for my sake at this point but for the sake of whatever relationship comes next for him. The pattern he carried into our marriage did not form in our marriage. It formed in his family over decades before I arrived. If he carries it forward unchanged into the next relationship, it will cost that person the same things. I hope he sees it before then. I hope whatever version of me he carries as the person who left gives him something useful to work with. I told my own story. That is this. The story I have told is not the story that circulated through our social world after the separation, but it is the true one, and it is the one that I know, and it is the one that I needed to say out loud so that it would exist somewhere outside of me. 9 years of trying. 9 years of being told the trying was insufficient. The specific and final clarity of standing in a kitchen doorway and hearing a woman tell your children that mommy is the problem. I was not too sensitive. I was paying attention. The difference matters. Have you ever raised a problem for years and been told you were imagining it, only for the problem to eventually become undeniable? Have you ever been the one who tried everything while the person you were trying for minimized everything? Have you ever left a situation you had been in too long and watched the person you left rewrite the history of it for an audience that did not know the full story? Leave your experience in the comments. Because being told you are too sensitive for long enough is its own kind of harm. And being handed a clean story that leaves out 9 years is not grief. It is revision. And the people who know only the revision deserve to know the rest. If you believe that 9 years of raising a real problem and being told you were imagining it is not nothing, that it has weight and consequence and that walking away from it is not abandonment but self-preservation, hit that like button and subscribe. Because Claire was not sensitive. She was clear. She saw what was happening for 9 years and she named it for 9 years and she gave him 9 years to choose to stand with her. He did not choose her. She finally chose herself. That is not the story of a woman who left without reason. That is the story of a woman who stayed well past the point where leaving was the obvious answer. #9 years of too sensitive.